Good evening, good morning. Welcome to week 3, George Washington University Safety and Security Leadership Program in the PSSL 6240, Political Violence and Terrorism. Just to cover some announcements, Adobe Connect session this Thursday, 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. It's not required. It's optional for everyone unless you're briefing, unless you're group 1, then yes, you will be there. I'll also say that that's a good time for office hours if there's any questions on the papers or any questions in general. It's also a good time to see what your classmates, what group 1 does for their presentation, so you can learn from it, as well as their content of their presentation, so you can get ideas, work through some of your issues as well. So Adobe Connect session this Thursday, 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Second announcement, paper due next Sunday. Very little room for extensions. If there's a problem, let me know early, but I don't want to give two extensions unless there's family emergency, medical emergency, things like that. I'm a little picky with the extensions. And then finally, the discussion sections. I'm good with those so far. Again, keep up what you're doing. Don't kind of slack off. Those are the only way to get that class interaction and to facilitate ideas in this class. So just review of last week and kind of prepping for the paper. What I have for you is an example paper, and I'll post that on YouTube as well, along with this, so you can see what a good example looks like. The bottom line for the paper and what you hopefully got from the second part of lesson 2 is what I call as argument points, or arguments points. That's how I want you to structure your paper. I want you to pick 3 or 4 arguments and drill down on those. Some of the ones that were brought up in the discussion section. Is it terrorism or is it not terrorism? Military versus non-military. And again, your paper is to take some of those definitions of terrorism that you guys learned in the lecture and you discussed in over the discussion section and apply it to either one of those scenarios that we covered in the lecture or another scenario that you think is more appropriate. But the whole point of the paper is what is terrorism, what is not terrorism, apply it to a situation. So military versus non-military. Some of you said the USS Cole, and the NCTC definition says that USS Cole would not be terrorism because it was a military target. You can also apply that logic to the Fort Hood shooting. There's different ways to couch it, but we think terrorism focuses on military assets, but maybe a better definition doesn't focus on military assets, and that could be one of your facets or one of your argument points for your paper. State versus non-state. A lot of you said that when you're talking about Dresden, because it was a state that did it, state-on-state conflict, you can't have terrorism in that respect. It was actually an act of war. That's an argument point for your paper. State versus non-state. Is the actor a state or non-state actor? Third, targeting within or outside the locus of conflict. This has a lot of applications in our history. For example, the Irgun targeted British military apparatus within the locus of conflict, within the Israel Arab areas, or between the Palestinian Arab areas. The Irgun did that, and you could argue that that's not terrorism. However, if they chose to focus their campaign in London, or in London specifically, the argument is that could be terrorism. Same with the FLN in Algeria. They focused on the locus of conflict in Algeria. If they chose to conduct attacks in Paris, maybe that is terrorism. And you could, again, hopefully this gets your mind around one of the arguments for what is terrorism, what is not. Attacking the apparatus of government versus civilians. Again, the Irgun chose to attack primarily the apparatus of government. Nelson Mandela chose to attack the apparatus of government. If you think that, or apparatus of government, apparatus of oppression, that might argue that it's not terrorism to do that. If you chose to attack random civilians, then yes, that might be a terrorist act. War zone versus non-war zone. This talks about, when I talked about the IED attack in Baghdad being a facet of terrorism. Most people said, no, it's not a facet of terrorism because Iraq is a war zone. Now, again, it depends on your definition of what is a war zone, but you can make the argument that the IED in Iraq was not terrorism, but Fort Hood was terrorism because one was in a war zone, one was not. But again, it's subject to your interpretation of what is a war zone. A political narrative. That's what separates terrorism from a criminal act, and you saw that in your examples, and many of you discussed it. The Columbine shooting, it's hard to make an argument there's a political narrative or a political objective that those two guys wanted to express. However, Fort Hood shooting, there certainly was that political narrative that, whether you believe it or right or wrong, that we shouldn't have been in the wars in Iraq or Afghanistan, or that we were oppressing Muslims. That was Nidal Hassan's political narrative, and that's what separates that from just a normal shooting that we've seen many times over the last few years. Levels of oppression. That's the other bullet there. This is an important distinction on what is terrorism, what isn't. If you're in a highly, highly, highly oppressed group, and the Irgun is probably the example, given the backdrop of the Holocaust, the argument, you saw it in the video, is that that's not terrorism because you are weak and you get to do things because you're highly, highly oppressed. Now, of course, levels of oppression is a subjective term, but the argument is that if you're in an oppressed group, a highly oppressed group like the FLN, in theory, or the Irgun, you get to do things. And again, that's something you have to argue in your paper one way or another. And then finally, again, these are just examples that were brought out in the discussion sections. Politically popular versus non-popular. And this is what kind of sets the difference between an insurgency and a terrorist act. If there's something's very politically popular, a group has high levels of popularity, you can argue, and that's the Viet Cong in Vietnam, that they're a resistance organization, or at the very least an insurgency. If they're not popular, they don't have some sort of popular support from the population, then they're a terrorist organization. They're just conducting violence against the will of the people. That's, again, subject to what you think is the will of the people, or where you think if the terrorist group is popular or not, or has popular support. But that's one of the arguments that says this is the difference between terrorism and this is the difference between an insurgency. So those are, again, some arguments that you can go one way, another, apply them to your papers, and that were brought up in the discussion section in the last paper, or the last discussion section in the last lectures. So just, again, paper, again, you'll see an example, paper, intro, argument, rebuttal, policy recommendations. That's kind of the structure I want you to see. So just quick intro, argument, again, 3 or 4 argument points, offer rebuttal, anticipate rebuttal arguments, and give policy recommendations if applicable. So that's how I want your paper to be structured. And just to give you, again, some more illustrative examples that kind of review what I just talked about a second ago. The Irgun, and if you take some of those examples, highly oppressed, focus on the apparatus of government within the locus of conflict. So if you want to argue one way or another, the Irgun's a terrorist organization, these are kind of examples of what might define it as a terrorist organization or not. The FLN, and now we're going to less terrorism to maybe more a terrorist group. So the FLN, highly oppressed. I don't know if you want to say the same levels of oppression as the Irgun, but you saw in the movie that the FLN were robbed, at least, of the ability to have the best land in Algeria. Their campaigns focused against civilians, not against military apparatus, at least as the campaign wore on. And then they focused on the locus of conflict. They didn't conduct attacks in Paris. Their attacks were on the Paris citizenry, or the French citizenry that were located in Algeria. And then finally, Al-Qaeda, again, in contrast to the above examples, lightly oppressed, focused on civilians outside the locus of conflict. Those are the kind of the facets of Al-Qaeda that make it a terrorist organization, because they're not heavily oppressed, at least not on the same scales as the FLN or the Irgun. Their focus primarily is to kill civilians, and not just civilians that are in the locus of conflict, like in Yemen or Saudi Arabia, but civilians in New York, Paris, London, Washington. So well outside the locus of conflict. So if you're going to define a terrorist organization, or that, the scale of what is a terrorist organization, the Irgun would probably fall on the less of a terrorist organization, while Al-Qaeda, because of those aspects there, would be on the more advanced level. So I hope that's clear as day. And again, when you see the YouTube video of the paper example, that will give you more analysis into it. So again, if there's any questions, please let me know. But that should give you enough guidance for the paper. And then what I want to just do is preview next week. Road to 9/11 documentary, excellent documentary, goes into not only the road to 9/11, but why after 9/11 did we see people celebrating in the streets. And that was a pretty, if not eye-opening, almost horrifying viewpoint that the American public saw. We saw people celebrating in Pakistan, in the West Bank, in Gaza. And the answer is why? What were the factors that not only led to 9/11, but led to almost that widespread anger against the United States that was on display right after 9/11? And we're going to look at political, social, economic, cultural, religious, historical causes that might have led to 9/11, and you're gonna look at why, what are the main factors that led to kind of this either backwardsness, if you want to say it, or political dysfunction that we sometimes see in the Middle East. And I'll let you decide on it, and the video gives a pretty good overview, and the Zakaria article does as well. And then what we move to the second part is terrorism finance. I just want to say that the PowerPoint for terrorism finance is a static one. It's not the lecture one, so just keep that in mind. And yeah, I look forward to your thoughts on the discussion board, and if there's any questions on the paper, please let me know.